Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Our Foundations Obsolete, A Brief History of White Supremacy in Philanthropy. My name is Hannah Holman, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Minnesota Theater Alliance. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. For those who don't know, the Minnesota Theater Alliance connects, supports, and advocates for our over 500 performing arts organizations of all types and budget sizes across the state, including rural, remote, urban, and suburban artists, administrators, and organizations. Our session today is being live captioned by Christy with Paradigm. Thank you. And we will be posting the link in the chat to open captions in a separate window if anyone would prefer this service that way. We're excited to be at our Zoom capacity today with this webinar, including performing arts folks and funders in Minnesota, as well as a few folks from other industries and states. At this time, we welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, and any affiliations or locations you'd like to share. Thanks to Ashley Hansen from the Department of Public Transformation for lightly monitoring the chat as we go along. This session will be in a webinar format, and attendees will not have access to microphone or video capabilities. Please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit any questions that come up, as there will be time at the end of the session to answer some of those. This session will be recorded for access at a later time and for folks for whom reliable internet access for live programming is a barrier. We acknowledge that we are all humans here together in this wild internet world, and in the event that our webinar freezes or lags, challenge yourself to take a moment to breathe and contemplate one of the last things you heard, instead of feeling agitated by any inevitable tech hiccups. For best viewing, we recommend selecting the side-by-side option from the viewing options at the top center of your screen on a computer or laptop. You may also select to enter or exit full screen mode through this viewing options menu. Now, I would like to take a moment to recognize that the Minnesota Theater Alliance serves organizations and individuals that live and work on land that was and is the home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. I am currently sitting on land that was forcefully taken from its original Dakota stewards through a series of unfair treaties starting in 1805. We invite you to take a moment of breath now together with us to consider where you are sitting and acknowledge the past, present, and future stewards of the land and the community. We all also acknowledge the colonization embedded in our systems, technologies, and ways of thinking every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. We invite you to take a moment of breath now to consider our responsibility to make good use of this time for learning and deep reflection. We acknowledge that systems currently in place have marginalized, underserved, and harmed Indigenous people, communities of color, immigrants and refugees, disabled persons, transgender persons, queer persons, and women and femme persons, most notably those at the intersections of those identities. We acknowledge the culture of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that is present in our society and in our performing arts community. We invite you to take a moment of shared breath now to consider our shared responsibility to demand accountability, transparency, and justice moving forward. Thank you. During this presentation, you may feel uncomfortable because you will be coming to new understandings. These new understandings will cause you to investigate the systems, processes, and relationships in which you have actively and passively participated in the past. We each need to be held accountable for these past experiences by ourselves and by others in order to move forward together as an industry and a community. This information may be especially uncomfortable to hear and process for individuals who are working in philanthropy. We are so glad you are here and that you are working to better understand the harmful systems that continue to work as they were designed to oppress our communities. In this space, we assert that discomfort is what leads to personal and professional growth that will change the community for the better. We ask you to move closer to your stretch zones and recognize the difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. We invite you to be present from a place of possibility by asking how rather than why or why not. You have and will make mistakes. This work is difficult, necessary, and ongoing, and we must be in it together. And with that, I am honored to toss things over to Joachim Schweigert and C. Thomas from Access Philanthropy to introduce themselves and get us rolling. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you so much, Hannah. My name is Joachim Schweigert. My pronouns are he, him, his. I just wanted to give y'all, before we jump into this, a little bit of context about myself and why I'm here talking about these things today. So I've been working at an organization called Access Philanthropy for the last 9 years. Access Philanthropy is a connecting organization that links foundations and nonprofits and foundations. My path to Access Philanthropy is from being a theater director. However, I'm also the artistic director of Open Flame Theater. We've been making work under various names for about 10 years. And it was through founding that theater company and looking for resources to support that theater company that I got connected to Access Philanthropy. So I'm really coming to this work from someone who is running a nonprofit theater organization. And also as a transgender person. Open Flame Theater is an all transgender theater company. So in my work with Access Philanthropy as the artistic director of Open Flame, I became really interested in like how and like where like the grants that we were applying for was coming from. What was this etiquette that I was learning about how to talk to funders, and became curious about how do funders talk with each other, and also how does this system, like where did this system come from, how does it work, all of these things. So that's sort of like the intersection that I am here speaking to. I'm really grateful to be able to talk about this topic because it's something that I've been researching for, pretty much my whole time at Access Philanthropy. And I get asked to talk about grants or grant writing or grant research a lot, but no one has ever asked me to talk about the white supremacist origins of philanthropy. So I'm really grateful to the Theater Alliance for opening up this platform. And I also just want to say that I am not an expert. This is a sharing and exploration of my own questions as I've been working in philanthropy while simultaneously running a nonprofit for the last decade. So this is really like my sharing of some of my research and some of my questions with you all. I'm grateful to be able to do that and to be in conversation and dialogue about these things. C, would you like to introduce yourself before we begin?
Sure. My name is C. Thomas. I use they, them pronouns. I am also an ensemble member with Open Flame Theater, and I have been working for Access Philanthropy, since about June. And I kind of work in the back end of the database website, and I'll be showing a little bit about how to access the database at the end of the webinar. And right now I'm just going to be kind of similarly in the background working with the PowerPoint. So Joachim, it's all you.
Awesome, thank you, C. All right, so let's go to our first slide, or our next slide. I feel like I want to circle back to the land acknowledgement that Hannah gave at the beginning. We, the presenters, C and I, are in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, which is stolen Dakota land. And that is really like the most like important part to understand about this whole context and about this whole system. So philanthropy is about amassing wealth, right? I mean, that's like how you get enough wealth to be able to give it away, is that you amass it. So at least that's the idea. So yeah, one of the first questions to be asking is like, okay, on whose backs was this wealth earned? How was this money made? That is one of the most crucial aspects in talking about philanthropy. And it was through genocide, slavery, and stolen land. I want to introduce an idea here of a term, racial capitalism, that was coined by Cedric J. Robinson, which is that capitalism itself is not distinct from racism. What Cedric argued is that the grounds on which capitalism emerges is already based on racial hierarchy, and therefore racism is interwoven with capitalism, therefore this phrase, racial capitalism. So how does this affect what we're talking about? I want to, bring up those questions, I want to bring up what Edgar Villanueva talks about as colonial dynamics. So who makes decisions about how investments are managed? Who gets to allocate that money? And then who gets that money? Who benefits from it? And I just want to say right away, right at the top, that there is still just a very, very small percentage of foundation dollars that are invested in communities of color. So that might be something that we already know, but just in setting the stage, so to speak, that's a very important thing to know and moving forward in this conversation. Okay, next slide, please. So yeah, so philanthropy is rooted in white supremacy. Philanthropy is one of the many arms that make up systemic racism and the system of white supremacy. What philanthropy does is it provides the moral justification necessary for the capitalist system to exist. And this is in fact one of its most dangerous elements. So yeah, so this is a huge part of why we're sharing this work today, is just to be used as an educational tool to inform people of the current system and work towards a new future. And I want to just say again that we are gonna barely scratch the surface of this stuff in the next hour. Yeah, there's a lot more to read and learn and explore within this. Okay, next slide, please. So a lot of what the research that we're going to be sharing today comes from the book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which was written and compiled by Insight, which is a national activist organization of radical feminists of color advancing a movement to end all forms of violence against women, gender nonconforming, and trans people of color through direct action, critical dialogue, and grassroots organizing. So what this book came out of is that in 2003, Insight received a major $100,000 grant from the Ford Foundation. Before the award had been given, however, a board member of the Ford Foundation at that time looked at the website of Insight and saw that they had a statement of support for Palestine up on their website. And this greatly offended this board member. And so the grant was revoked. So this really sparked the question for Insight, what is the true relationship between foundations and nonprofits? Next slide, please. And so what this book describes is the way in which capitalist interests and the state use nonprofits to monitor and control social justice movements, divert public monies into private hands through foundations, manage and control dissent in order to make the world safe for capitalism, redirect activist energies into career-based modes of organizing instead of mass-based organizing capable of actually transforming society, allow corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work, and encourage social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than to challenge them. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But I really encourage all of you, if you haven't read this book, read this book. And there will be, at the end of the webinar, we'll have like a list of our resources, and the website will be there that you can order the book from. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to do some definitions of terms. What is the nonprofit industrial complex? The NPIC, as defined by Insight, is a system of relationships between the state or local and federal governments, the owning classes, foundations, and nonprofit/NGO social service and social justice organizations. Next slide, please. Dylan Rodriguez defines the nonprofit industrial complex as a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent, progressive, and leftist social movements. Okay, so really what we're talking about here is to understand the system, we're talking about like 3 different entities and how they all work together, okay? So we're talking about state and local governments, we're talking about the owning and the ruling class, and then we're talking about NGOs and nonprofits. Okay, so the patterns of relationships between this like little triangle is like what we're gonna be talking about. Dylan Rodriguez and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and many others argue that the nonprofit industrial complex is the natural corollary to the prison industrial complex. We're not going to be talking about that today, but if you don't know the term prison industrial complex, or even if you do know the term, I highly suggest that you read more about it, because that's a crucial part of this. It's another piece of this whole system that we're not going to be talking about today, but it's an important piece. Okay, in the United States, the raw size of private foundations, along with their desire to affect the course of events in the United States and the world, has made foundations one of the handful of major political actors in our society, but they are the one that draws the least public attention. That is a quote by Nicholas Lehman from his article, Citizen 501c3 from the Atlantic Monthly. Yeah, and that's another reason why we're talking about this today. I feel like it's really important to understand how money works in a capitalist system, and you can really learn a lot from that. And I have been, yeah, there's a lot to uncover here. So that's one of the reasons why we're here today, is to draw attention to this issue. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what is the history of the foundation system? All right, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s is when we saw the first robber barons. So like massive, wealthy, millionaire capitalists, right? Some of these were Russell Sage, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie. The first foundation was the Sage Foundation, which was established in 1907. Okay, so foundations were established in order to shield wealth from taxation. They became safe havens for the rich to hoard and amass their wealth. In addition to this, the justification for keeping the money private via foundations was to be able to determine personally how that money should be used. Next slide, please. Okay, so a crucial part of this is white saviorism, and which is the defined by Wikipedia as a white person who provides help to non-white people in a self-serving manner. Their role is considered a modern-day version of what is expressed in the poem The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. So philanthropists can maintain an ethic and moral compass rooted in white saviorism, in which they believe they are better suited to distribute and use funds than the people they are serving or the government. And this is not just something that me and other people have mused about in seeing the history of this. This was actually inherent to the beginning of foundations and their founding at the very beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so Andrew Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, which describes the responsibility of philanthropy. Okay, so the Gospel of Wealth is it is why foundations were created, you know, and what they can do for the people. And it begins with the discussion of inequity and a justification for the class divide. The Gospel of Wealth has been called the ur-text of modern philanthropy. Sorry. It is the pinnacle and cornerstone of the moral and ethical justification for the class divide, rooted deeply in the white savior complex and deeper, more pervasive forms of white supremacy. So I'm going to read this quote that Andrew Carnegie wrote in the Gospel of Wealth. It says this: "The man of wealth," by which he means a white man of wealth, should consider himself the mere trustee and agent for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer. So inherent within all these ideas is that if you are wealthy, that you deserve to be wealthy, and that with that deservedness of being wealthy comes this responsibility It means that you are worthy of being the person to decide where this wealth should go and how to heal the ills of society. Yeah, this was the very real, like, nuts and bolts ideas of why to have philanthropy in the first place. Next slide, please. Okay, so when this began, there were many people who were very critical of this system. Most notably because foundations were concerned in maintaining the interests of the wealthy. That seemed very apparent from their beginning. Next slide, please. So in 1916, just 9 or 10 years after the first foundation was created, was written the Walsh Report. And in the Walsh Report, or the Walsh Commission, in 1916, I'm going to read this quote from Andrea Smith, the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, aka the Walsh Commission, filed a report on labor issues with Congress, warning that foundations were a grave menace because they concentrated wealth and power in the service of ideology which supported the interests of their capitalist benefactors. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do foundations actually give? And when we say like amass, what do we mean? Okay, so foundations are only required to disperse 5% of their net worth in assets per year. In that 5%, the foundations can include the cost of running the foundation, the payment of the trustees. Also, side note, many of these trustees are family members and are descendants from these original robber barons. And also, trustees of foundations have often, especially larger foundations, are often paid hundreds of thousands of dollars into the millions. And then lobbying efforts are also included. Now, this is really crucial because the whole reason that there is this ability for foundations to exist is that by they are able to, like, so foundations, philanthropists are able to make money, and then instead of that wealth being taxed by the income tax, then it can go into this foundation. And then only 5% of that needs to be given back. And it can include all these things that I'm talking about. And where the lobbying efforts come in is that foundations also spend a great deal of money on lobbying efforts to keep these laws the same, so that this 5% doesn't need to increase, and so that restrictions around income tax don't need to change. Okay, so what is the relationship between foundations and nonprofits, and how did it begin? Next slide, please. Okay, so the origin of the nonprofit. According to the IRS, nonprofits are religious, charitable, scientific, or educational organizations whose receipts are tax exempt and whose contributions are tax deductible for the donors. So this tax exempt status was created by Congress as part of the Revenue Act of 1913, passed after the ratification of the 16th Amendment, which is what instituted the income tax. Generally, organizations must secure 501c3 status to receive foundation grants and are prohibited from direct involvement in political advocacy. So basically, a much larger percentage of wealthy people's income would be collected, but instead those monies can be put into a foundation and then they become untaxable. So it's a loophole. Next slide, please. So according to the independent sector, there are 1.6 million tax-exempt organizations in the United States. This includes all 501c designations from churches and cultural centers to food banks and disaster relief organizations. Now, the nonprofit sector, which another part of the Gospel of Wealth that Andrew Carnegie wrote, was talking about how it's like the duty of these nonprofit arts organizations to step in, not the government, right? Now, this is like a bit of capitalist rhetoric that's been recycled a lot, so I'm sure we're like pretty familiar with it. You know, leave it to like the churches and the nonprofits to, to meet people's basic needs, etc. Okay, so the nonprofit sector has grown by 20% over the last 10 years, according to a new report published by the PNP Staffing Group. Despite this, research from the Council on Foundations and Common Fund shows that giving by private foundations barely fluctuated between 2009 and 2018. Even as stocks rallied to historic gains following the Great Recession and federal policies shifted dramatically, spending rates stayed between 5.4 and 5.8%. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do foundations keep their assets? Now, foundations don't just amass assets, they also make money. So yeah, so philanthropists, make and inherit money, then they make it untaxable by putting it in foundations and only have to give up 5%. So what happens with the endowment? Most of the time, it gets invested back into the stock market to generate even more income. So practically speaking, this system creates a support beam of wealth itself, so it can continue into the future and grow exponentially. And this is a really key point because there was a decision made that a foundation's goal should be to continue into perpetuity. And a lot of the decisions about how foundations are run are made with a mathematical mind that are all about like, how do we preserve this and keep expanding this money? And that's like what's considered successful. Okay, so within that context, now, today, as of like, a couple of weeks ago, in an article published by Inside Philanthropy, it was stated that private foundations are sitting on top of over $1 trillion in wealth, with a mandate that they pay out a minimum of 5% of their assets on an annual basis. And I just want to remind everyone that, again, this 5% can contain the cost of running the foundation, compensation for trustees, and lobbying efforts. Okay, so 1 trillion. An additional 120 billion is parked in donor-advised funds with no mandated payout whatsoever. For those of you that don't know, in the United States, a donor-advised fund is a charitable giving vehicle administered by a public charity created to manage charitable donations on behalf of organizations, families, or individuals. So when we say that foundations are amassing assets, yeah, we're talking about a lot of money. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here we have a quote by Andrea Smith from Insight. So, in summary, when wealthy people create foundations, they are exempt from paying taxes on their wealth. Thus, foundations essentially rob the public of monies that should be owed to them and give back very little of what is lost in, or what is taken in lost taxes. In addition, their funds are derived from profits resulting from the exploitation of labor. That is, corporations become rich by exploiting their workers. Corporate profits are then put into foundations in order to provide relief to the worker that are the result of corporate practices in the first place. Okay, so this is Andrea Smith discussing the work of Christine E. Ahn. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's sort of like the past. What about now? The current era that we're living in is being referred to as the new Gilded Age, which is sort of a really nice way of saying, or maybe a nice way of saying, we live in a plutocracy. In the past 15 years alone, 30,000 private foundations have been created, and the number of donor-advised funds has tripled. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Anand Giridharadas, who is a journalist who in 2011 was named a Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute. And in 2015, he condemned what he called the Aspen Consensus. The Aspen Consensus, in a nutshell, is this, he says. The winners of our age must be challenged to do more good, but never, ever tell them to do less harm. And he talks about this more in a book that he created called Winners Take All, the Elite Charade of Changing the World. And in this book, he created portraits of current philanthropists who believed and desired to do good, but who never questioned how they had come to have the power to be able to do so much good in the first place. And at this point, I want to introduce this idea because Anand describes these conversations in which there's a lot of what people would maybe call white fragility happening. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation. But I actually think that term white fragility is really problematic because it continues this idea, sorry about that, continues this idea of white people being victims. And it sort of like has this idea of like, oh, like I'm so fragile. And that's actually when what happens in situations where white fragility is expressing itself is like, that is violence. It's violence. And so this is where the concept of white flammability, which is a term coined by Sun Shin, who some of you might know, comes into play. And I want to just like give a shout out to Sun Young for that idea, because I think it's like, it's a crucial part of this conversation and about of like this whole dynamic, particularly like with philanthropists, as we'll discuss later in the presentation. And so I want to, so it feels important at this moment to like introduce that like these sort of like, these awkward or silencing conversations are not a symptom of someone's fragility, but of violence. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to quote my friend DePunker from Pangeo World Theater, the time of liberal niceties is over. What do we mean by that? Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk for a little bit about the relationships between grants, between grantors and grantees. Nonprofits often feel intimidated, or like they don't know the correct social cues when interacting with foundations. 10 years ago, when I first started applying for grants, I was terrified to call a funder. And partly it was because it just, there was like this whole etiquette around it that I felt like I didn't know. And it seemed like there was some like culture of deference that foundations and wealthy philanthropists were given that I like didn't quite know the rules for. But it's important to know like how and why this culture of deference came to exist, and which is through the glorification of these, these like robber barons doing all of this like philanthropy, how it came to exist, and why it in and of itself is harmful, why this culture of liberal niceties is actually really violent, and why we need to move beyond it. So there's this idea that because foundations have this guise of like doing good, there is a culture of necessitated respect. But what is the kind of good that philanthropists do? And the kind of good. Also, I just want to say that like there's, we're obviously critiquing like a whole system here, and there's a lot of examples. There's just a lot of examples. So we're just gonna do two. So what is the kind of good that philanthropists do, and what is truly underlying the supposed altruism? Next slide, please. Okay, so our first example is George Soros. So George Soros is a well-known philanthropist who made his money in stocks and managing hedge funds. He created over 25 open society foundations. Open society foundations are reported to financially support civil society groups around the world with a stated aim of advancing justice, education, public health, independent media. However, there's nothing in this vision that challenges the pillars on which philanthropy is built, nor the systems that maintain it. Next slide, please. Okay, so in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, there is this meeting that it is described that is at an Open Society Institute board meeting, in which there is a fight going on about how some money should be spent. In this meeting, George Soros was quoted as saying, "This is my money, we will do it my way." The reply that he received was, after a very uncomfortable silence, was, "No, it isn't. Half of it is ours. If you hadn't placed that money in OSI or another of your 25 foundations, about half of it would be in the treasury." Well, this person was fired, but their point was really valid. It is estimated that about 45% of the $1 trillion owned by foundations that they hold in their coffers actually belongs to the American public. Next slide, please. Okay, so example 2. The Gates Foundation. So as of 2007, the Gates Foundation had spent $6 billion per year vaccinating people in Africa from diseases such as AIDS. The foundation reports that it has saved over 100,000 lives. But what do pharmaceutical companies creating the vaccines have to do with Microsoft? So they're both protected by trade-related intellectual property rights, which bars African countries from being able to purchase AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis medicines at cheap market prices. That's a quote from Greg Palast. The Gates Foundation has also invested $200 million into the very drug companies that have barred low-cost drug and vaccine shipments into Africa. So the Gates Foundation is able to maintain this system of oppression by manufacturing its image of doing good and saving lives. So there's been, so in a way, philanthropy can sort of like work as like this reputation laundering service also. Another example would be the Sackler family, who became really wealthy by manufacturing opioids. And there was a lot of critique of the Sackler family and how they were profiting from the opioid crisis. They gave several very large key gifts to some art museums in New York, and a lot of that bad press really started to like die away. Yeah, I mean, another point that Anand makes is that if you or a class of people can get out in front and do some kind of like lavish donation, then a senator has a way to meet with you because you've like cleaned yourself up enough. For the record now, some of those museums are now taking the Sackler family name off of them. So there's like, we were seeing some signs that like this system has cracks in it, and those cracks are potentially widening, which is encouraging. But as of right now, the game is still stacked to benefit people like the Gateses and like the Sacklers. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us to the question, can foundations fund systemic change? So foundations claim that they can't pay out very much in funding if they want to continue to have money into the future. Again, this like principle of perpetuity or the justification of perpetuity. If we want them to continue, then they need to, you know, keep the principle of their endowment very secure. Yeah, this is because on paper and mathematically driven by boards and trustees, the purpose is to actively seek to continue to amass wealth. That's how many foundations like gauge their level of success. It's not whether they're meeting their missions or, you know, many other things. It's about whether they're able to continue into perpetuity. So within this system, we have people who are working at nonprofits, spending countless hours working on very small grants while foundation endowments keep growing. Yeah, and to quote Anand one more time, we're living in a time in which most people agree we need systemic change, and we have outsourced that job to those who have the most to lose from that systemic change. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some examples of this? So, and what is the relationship between leftist movements and foundations? Foundations have worked to undermine and tame revolutionary movements in the 60s and 70s in the United States and across the world, and continue to do so to this day. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. One is from Robert Arnault's edited volume, Philanthropy and Cultural Imperialism. Foundations have a corrosive influence on a democratic society. They represent relatively unregulated and unaccountable concentrations of power and wealth, which by talent promote causes and in effect establish an agenda of what merits society's attention. They serve as cooling out agencies, delaying and preventing more radical structural change. They help maintain an economic and political order, international in scope, which benefits the ruling class interests of philanthropists. And from James Petrus, NGOs in the service of imperialism. NGOs receive funds from overseas governments and or are subsidized by corporate funded private foundations with close working relations with the state. Their programs are not accountable to local people, but to overseas donors who review and oversee the performance of the NGOs according to their criteria and interests. The NGO officials are self-appointed, and one of their key tasks is designing proposals that will secure funding in many cases, In many cases, this requires that NGO leaders find out the issues the Western funding elites fund, then shape proposals accordingly. Next slide, please. So one specific example would be the Black liberation movement here in this country in the 60s and 70s. So foundations have a history of encouraging assimilationist values instead of movements toward true liberation. The Ford Foundation partnered with the CIA to undermine the movement for Black liberation in the 1960s and 70s. This was because, according to Howard Dressner, who was the secretary of the Ford Foundation in 1969, American society is being strained at one extreme by those who would destroy what they oppose or do not understand, and at the other by forces that would repress variety and punish dissent. We are in great need of more, not fewer, instruments for necessary social change under law, for read, informed response to deep-seated problems without chaos, for accommodation or a variety of views without deafening anarchy. Foundations have served as such an instrument. Next slide, please. So foundations are able to shape movements to their own desires, which includes continuing the white hegemonic power system. Next slide, please. So what are some of the ways in which they do this? Many grants come with strict rules and guidelines about how the funding should be spent within the organization. This means that foundations not only choose who gets funded or how much, but also how the organization spends those funds. This only furthers the power of foundations and increases their ability to undermine revolutionary movements. Another example would be that one of the largest environmental funders is the Kinder Morgan Foundation. And that is not a unique phenomenon at all. Many of the largest, the biggest polluters are the ones that give the most to environmental justice movements or environmental groups. Now, okay, so these extremely stringent requirements that are placed on nonprofits or grantees are not an accident. They are a symptom of distrust and a tool for control. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about arts and culture and how this works in arts and culture for a little bit. So according to the Star Tribune, the list of 2019's top 100 largest nonprofits in Minnesota includes only 5 arts organizations. They are the American Public Media Group, the MIA, Twin Cities Public Television, the Guthrie Theater Foundation, and MCAD. So why these organizations? And I want to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Bear in mind that foundations are repositories of twice stolen wealth. A, profit sheltered from B, taxes, that can be retrieved by those who stole it at the opera or the museum, at Harvard, or a fine medical facility. And so I think what this quote is speaking to is that there is sort of this sense that like these institutions, MIA, MCAD, the Guthrie, the Minnesota Orchestra has often been on this list, is that these are organizations that are sort of like crown jewels of the Twin Cities. And that like, you know, they have to get funded because, you know, like how could we like have Minnesota like without the Guthrie or without the MIA or, but the question that I've been finding myself asking more and more is like, what would be possible if these organizations were not absorbing so many, so great of a percentage of the grant dollars for the arts in the Twin Cities? And why is it that we see the same, I've been looking at this list from the Star Tribune every year for about 10 years, and it's the same organizations, particularly the same arts organizations that are on that list almost every single year. So yeah, why is that? And what would things look like if they were different? And why aren't they already different? Next slide, please. So yeah, because foundations have the resources to fund many more organizations than they fund. They choose not to. They choose to continue amassing their wealth and prioritizing existing into perpetuity over funding more organizations and more people. Next slide, please. So a lot of times when change is called for, like, you know, from large institutions, and I'm sure that we've all heard this, like at one point, regardless of what institution we're interacting with, that change happens slow. But during COVID, and particularly at the end of March and the beginning of April, we were seeing foundations were making like huge pivots, like at the drop of a hat, and that they we're suddenly glimpsing how easy it is actually for foundations to rapidly adjust application procedures, rules, requirements, etc. And what this really reveals is the burden that's placed on social justice or social service nonprofits to prove that we're worthy, and seeing the distrust with which leftist foundations regard the very people and movements they claim to support. Next slide, please. So why am I calling out leftist foundations? Okay, because progressive foundations and conservative foundations actually work very, very differently. So progressive leftist foundations often give to organizations that providing basic needs with concrete outcomes, food shelves, housing initiatives, books for children, etc. They also want quantifiable deliverables. And a lot of this is because people running those foundations don't quite trust the very people that they claim to serve. So that's why we see this trend of like, there being like not a lot of general operating support grants out there, and not a lot of multi-year funding. And also just like such an increase in reporting requirements of like, being asked to prove quantifiably the impact that you're having. When really the impact of all of the admin work that is required for writing these grant reports is also extremely taxing, not to mention how taxing the application process itself can be. So what's really interesting about this is that conservative right-wing foundations work in a really different way. They've invested less money in philanthropy altogether, but what they fund are ideas, think tanks, and they often give unrestricted grants. They have very minimal reporting requirements, and they give a lot of multi-year funding. And what this creates is a system that then becomes more sustainable for these right-wing organizations. And we're really seeing the ripples of this now, because they were funding in massive amounts the people who created this conservative agenda that we're seeing now in the 60s through the 80s, and this was very deliberate. Much of our current evangelical political climate, as well as the Trump presidency, has come as a direct result of this type of funding. This link here that's on the bottom of the slide, which I believe is also at the end on the resources page, is a really incredible article by the New York Times detailing how the Heritage Foundation really just paved the way for Trump in so many different ways. Yeah, it's a really fascinating article, and that whole aspect of this conversation is really interesting. We're spending one slide talking about this, which is like kind of absurd because there's like so much to say and there's so much to unpack, but there's also like so much to say and so much to unpack about all of this stuff. So yeah, so let's move on. Okay, so yeah, so this is all of these things together is part of why the time of liberal niceties needs to be over. All these sets of relationships, which creates the nonprofit industrial complex, is they promote a social movement culture that is non-collaborative, narrowly focused, and competitive. And I want to share another quote from Anand. Perhaps it is the extraordinarily elite generosity itself that upholds the idea of extraordinary elite hoarding. What if all this do-gooding is just enough to preserve the manic hyper-capitalism that makes it impossible to live a decent life? And so, yeah, I think this is really like where I have come to in my research about all of these things, is that philanthropy is not just ineffective at social change, or ineffective at, solving like the ills of society. Like, it is instrumental in maintaining it, because it provides a moral justification for amassing wealth in the first place, which we have already covered only comes because of exploiting workers and because of a history of slavery, genocide, and stolen land. Yeah, okay. So short of dismantling foundations, what are some strategies for addressing this? This is something that, again, there's so much more to think about in regards to this. And there's some of us are starting to come together to meet and talk about some of these things. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But for a moment, maybe speaking more to the philanthropists or the foundations who have been joining us for this conversation, I want to offer some possible potential solutions that we could start putting in place immediately to help change some of these dynamics. Okay, so first, fund people who are working directly in the communities they claim to serve. This part is really, really important. Another one would be like, give more general operating support, give more multi-year funding, create easier application procedures, and de-emphasize or eliminate arduous reporting requirements. Also, if you run a nonprofit like I do, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how nonprofits can act as buffers between foundations and grassroots social movements. And this is something that they get into in a lot more detail in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that I think is really interesting. And there's a lot to explore there. Now, somebody might be thinking, well, what about spending down? So spending down is the phenomenon by which I'm not sure if phenomenon is the right word, practice, by which foundations can sort of spend themselves out of existence. So if they stop choosing to, to reinvest, to put their assets into the stock market, and if they decide to start giving out of their principal, they can spend themselves out of existence. But there's two key problems with this. One, it's still the people in power making the decisions about how funding is distributed. So again, the first point on this slide about funding people who are working directly in the communities they claim to serve, this is really, really crucial if you want to be funding into social movements. It's very crucial. And then sure, like a foundation may fund itself out of existence, but that does nothing to change the system that allowed them to amass such wealth in the first place. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to close, I want to read this quote by Tiffany Lafabo King and Iware Oseande. Philanthropy is not progressive and never has been. Philanthropy never intends to fund revolutionary struggle that demands the just seizure of wealth, resources, and power that has been gained by exploiting the bodies, lives, and land of people of color worldwide. Next slide, please. Okay. So if you want to engage more in these questions, like I said, we really have just scratched the surface on these things. So if you're interested in meeting and talking about these things, Catalyst Arts, founded by Shay Cage, is holding town hall meetings in part to address this history and work to create a new, more equitable future. Now, the town halls are there's a lot of different breakout groups and a lot of people working on a lot of different things, but the group strategizing around funding in particular is meeting next on July 8th at 10 a.m. This will be a virtual meeting. And the larger town halls are on the second Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. So if you're interested in getting involved, learning more about this stuff, trying to imagine other possibilities, other futures, please reach out. You can reach Catalyst Arts at infocatalyst@gmail.com or by finding Catalyst Arts on Facebook by the same name. Okay, and now I want to turn things over to C about how to access the database. So part of what Access Philanthropy does is we have a database that we maintain of private funders, public funders, corporate funders, corporate giving programs, and we have about 3,000 3,000 funders in the database as a whole. I think over 3,000 now, actually. And part of what C and I do is organize all these funders into different lists. So we have a list that is specifically of Minnesota Arts, a list specifically of Minnesota Arts funders. And we are giving access, 3 months of access away to all of you who came to this presentation with the promo code that's included here. So yeah, I think now I'm going to turn it over to C and have them share with you how to access the database.
Great. Thank you so much, Joaquin. I'm going to close out of our
PowerPoint for a moment here so we can get actually to this database page. Or maybe I'll just open it like that. So this is the database.accessphilanthropy.com. What you're going to want to do is you're going to go to set up an account either up here or right down here. Click on it, and you'll be taken to this purchase a subscription page. Under select a plan, you're going to click promo code. And then you're going to enter the promo code, which is MTA 2020. You're going to fill out your billing information. So you'd put in your name, first and last, your email, and then a billing address. And then you would click submit down there at the bottom. And you'll be taken to a confirmation page. And then after that, you'll be able to access the funders tab, which is up here. And it will take you to a page similar to this, which will list all of the foundations that are in our Minnesota Arts list. And then you can click on each one of those and be taken to a page full of information about these funders. This is kind of what Access Philanthropy does. You'll have access to direct phone numbers, websites, contact names and emails for executive directors, development managers, program directors. You'll have information about geographic interests. And we also report financial information, total assets, total giving. There will also be a copy of the most recent 990 report. And you can see trends in giving. Here is very interesting in the Blade of Grass. You'll also have access to names of trustees and directors, as well as some general information, including funding restrictions. We also have some takeaway notes that can be important when you're looking at different foundations and choosing which to apply to. Some, again, general information. We also do something called AP Insights, which is we do specific work doing research about the executives and where they give personally, because sometimes personal donations don't exactly match the foundation's ideals potentially, and that's something important to know. And then we also usually have application information, deadline information, submission needs, timetables, and links to social media profiles. So that would be an example of what is in a funder list. So again, just going to this database page, setting up an account, coming to this page, selecting a plan, promo code, putting the promo code right in there, filling out the rest of this information and clicking submit, and you'll have free access to 3 months to that Minnesota Arts Funders page. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we wanted to present that information and make this information available because one of the key things that, you know, we're not going to, you know, dismantle this system overnight. And in the meantime, a lot of us are running organizations who still need to survive. And in that context, there's still the gatekeeping that is there between mainstream organizations and smaller organizations, particularly organizations working for social justice, is pretty massive. And so that's something that Access Philanthropy works diligently as much as we can to to support. We take on a lot of pro bono clients, particularly organizations who are led by and in the service of queer, trans, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color. So if you're interested in being a pro bono client, if you, that's also something that you can talk to us about. But yeah, anyway, so I think now I'll turn it back over to Hannah for, I think we have some time for a Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joaquin and C, for this incredible presentation. There's so much to sink in, so much more that isn't even in these slides, which we will provide to attendees. And so I also recommend anyone who's here to watch it again on the recording. I'm going to do that. But with that, I'm going to put some questions to you that have come in from folks. And of course, acknowledging that you are just one person with a wealth of knowledge, but not an expert. So answer as you will with that. So this one comes in, this information has been so invaluable, and having this knowledge feels like it gives us real power to create change. Thank you. My question is, what advice do you have for small nonprofits who are trying to navigate this oppressive philanthropic system in how we might begin to have these conversations with program officers? Or do we avoid working from the inside, remove ourselves from foundation support altogether, and work towards building an alternative or pushing from the outside? Another question that came in was, how do you recommend that we be less nice in working with foundations on opening up their funding? I felt like that was a little bit related. I'll toss that to you, Joaquin.
Oh my gosh, those questions are awesome. Yeah, this is something that I am asking myself. And I think that there's, let's see, I kind of feel like there were two different questions there. One, there's like the how to be less nice thing, changing the culture thing. And then there was the, do I recommend, or how do I, like, do I recommend like just not working in foundations or with foundations altogether? Yeah, okay. So we're all figuring out how to survive. And I don't think that it is, I think that's something that we all need to figure out. I mean, something that the revolution will not be funded really suggests is that you figure out how to get funded by your own constituents, which is something that can be like really challenging for those of us whose constituents are people with marginalized identities. But there are ways, I think, to figure that out. And I think that's something that I personally am like in a step to figure out myself. Open Flame Theater, my theater company, is almost all grant funded right now, which doesn't mean that like we have all of the money we need. That's what I mean, is that like most of our operating budget right now comes from grant money. And so it's something that I'm figuring out and negotiating myself. I think that like while and like while we're in the process of figuring that out, like if you need money to survive and you can get it from foundations, then like, I think you can pursue that. I think, yeah, a lot of us are, most of us are. And so I think the question is like, yeah, and I wonder like to what extent the change in the system is going to come from grantees, and to what extent is it going to come from the people running these foundations, and to what extent is it going to come from politicians who change the tax laws that allow foundations to exist. I think that in regards to like being nice to funders, like I think I can really only speak to myself personally. And I think, like Hannah mentioned at the beginning about like ways in which like we're all, or like ways in which like we're like complicit in the system, And I think one of the ways in which like I've been complicit is like, like the level of like deference or space making that like I have made for foundations who are like doing site visits or things like that. Putting funders or like people working for foundations that I'm interacting with like up on pedestals. I was watching this interview with Edgar Villanueva, who wrote this book, Decolonizing Wealth, that I mentioned at the beginning. And someone asked him a question very similarly, but in a different context. And one of the things that he said is that we need to first just start treating each other and regarding each other as human beings, as opposed to sitting down and having conversations where we're like each trying to like get something out of the other person, which like can often be what conversations between like grantors and grantees are like. And so yeah, I don't know. That seems like a very like small step to take, but I wonder how much even just like, you know, I want the dynamic to be, if a funder is like coming to do like a site visit with Open Flame, like my all transgender theater company that I work with, I don't want it to be that everybody in Open Flame is like, you know, just like behaving with deference and like, you know, making space for the funder. I want it to be that like the funder is honored to be in our space and is honored to be there having a conversation with us. And yeah, to invite someone to like into into working with us, regardless of how that working is happening, is like we take those, you know, often we feel like a lot of tenderness about our collaborations, and there's like mutual honoring that's happening. And I, as the director, like I set up the context for that, or I set up the context for that in a lot of different ways. How does the rehearsal room look like? You know, is there a chair set out for somebody? Like, is there water? Like all of these different things. So anyway, I guess that was sort of like a roundabout way of like putting it, but I think that, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it can be a starting place. And I think that also is like a really important part to like as a decolonizing practice in general. And this is also something that Edgar Villanueva talks about, that yeah, that we stop treating each other as only having value based on our usefulness, and just really begin having practices in which we're like mutually recognizing each other's humanity.
Yeah, thanks, Joaquin. Your answer kind of had me thinking about ideas of what someone who works in philanthropy perhaps, how can the emails you send, how can the ways in which you invite people, how can you set up that room, like you set up a rehearsal room to create the space for that power dynamic to shift and even out in some ways as a small step. So thank you. Another question. When you were talking about nonprofits being buffers between funders and grassroots movements, is that considered a positive or negative aspect of the current system? And could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. I meant it as a positive, and it's talked about in the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded as a Positive Thing. But I would be happy to be proven wrong about that. Yeah, so the idea with that is, if like a funder could control what a nonprofit does through a grant agreement, but if then the nonprofit is then distributing that money to social movements, they can take those, they can like then those requirements are not put on the grassroots social movements. So I think that's sort of like one way that can look. Like it's just in a like purely like financial way. But also I think that it can happen like, I mean, yeah, in situations like, I mean, there's just a lot of really deep, you know, the Ford Foundation's like previous collaborations with the CIA is like one example, right? I'm sure there are more. And so, you know, so nonprofits like being the ones interfacing with foundations, maybe that means that like foundations then like don't have the names of the people who are leading the movements, or like aren't able to like influence them in the same way. So I think like it can keep grassroots social, grassroots movement leaders like just safe from the state in like a very like, yeah, like in regards to surveillance, in regards to physical safety, Yeah, a lot of different things. Yeah, those are like two examples of things that come to mind immediately, that are talked about in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. But yeah, I'm sure that there are more. Yeah, I mean, if foundations don't want to have, if a foundation wants to appear as if they're funding justice, but don't actually want, the system that's allowing them to continue to amass wealth to change, then, there's a certain extent to which, like, yeah, we need to protect some of our activities from them. Um, and so, yeah, so nonprofits can be a good way to do that.
Thanks. And I can also see how a lot of the things you said ring true, and also it's complex because how deep do the layers of gatekeeping go in that, as we think about nonprofit organizations being helpful and also very unhelpful at times. I just was pondering some of that, which also leads a little bit into the next question. And if you want to respond to that as well, I can let you. Great.
Just, yeah, I agree.
Great. So the question is, do you have any ideas about how to systematically solve the gatekeeping problem? People and foundations will always have a bulk of the wealth. How can any of them determine who deserves, that money and how much? So thinking about gatekeeping and possible solutions or ideas around that.
Yeah, well, I think gatekeeping happens in two different ways. I think it happens both in regards to who gets the money, but then it also happens in regards to who is able to know, who even knows that money is out there, or how to apply to get it. And I think, like, once I started applying for grants, that's like one of the reasons why I wanted to start working with Access Philanthropy, is that I was like, wow, like, it was just like outrageous, like how much I had to learn in order to even like be like a beginner novice in like grant writing, approaching foundations, like all of this stuff. And yeah, I think that there would be, if like the grant application process, if accessing funders was like a more transparent thing, but like it's not, because it's all private, so it's like we can find, we in Minnesota like have more sort of like there's like as like problematic as they can be sometimes, we have the Minnesota State Arts Board, and we have this like cultural legacy money, but a lot of people, a lot of states don't have things quite like that, and so the whole system is private. And I'm not saying that like writing an MRAT grant or a Minnesota State's Art Board grant is like easy or accessible, because like it's yeah, but that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so the whole like, so I think there's gatekeeping in like both of those ways. And I think that like yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, and for the first one, like how to remove the gatekeeping around the money itself. I mean, it's I mean, that's why like the title of this webinar is like, "Are Foundations Obsolete?" which I want to say, in case we haven't said already, or you don't know, that that's a that is an homage to Angela Davis's work, "Are Prisons Obsolete?" I mean, that's why we're asking this question, is like, I'm not sure that it is possible, quite frankly, to just like fix the gatekeeping issue and keep foundations. Like I, like this quote that we ended with, revolutionary, like, I don't believe that revolutionary, philanthropy never intends to fund a revolutionary struggle that demands the just seizure of wealth, resources, and power that has been gained by exploiting bodies, lives, and land of people of color worldwide. Oh, thanks, C. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like this, like, we need reparations. This wealth, land, it needs to get redistributed in order to be equitable. And so and since philanthropy is rooted in being able to amass wealth, like, I don't see like how it could be, yeah, how we could adjust that. In regards to like what we can do about it now, I mean, I think like, uh, I want to start having conversations with like our, like Open Flames funders about some of these things, um, uh, like about like more general operating support. Like we get like, we survive a lot on like program support as many like leftist or like just smaller nonprofits do. Um, yeah, and like broaching those topics. I think that was like a little rambly. I hope whoever asked that question feels like I answered it.
Thanks, Joaquin. I also want to jump in and quick say that we're pointing folks to continue the conversation. We're pointing them to Catalyst Arts. As one reason is because they've already got momentum going. They're already having these arts town halls, and we're trying to point people to where things are already happening, which I think is an example of not everyone needs to reinvent the wheel, in the ways in which we can collaborate together can help with some of that gatekeeping, I think. Obviously now once it's size fits all, quick solution, but trying to point people, and that's specifically a BIPOC-led movement building work. So we want to point you to that to continue that conversation. And I'll keep going with a couple more questions, if that's okay, Joaquin.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah, thanks. So quick question, what is the regular annual fee for the Access Philanthropy database? Or if there's anything else Access Philanthropy has that you'd like to share?
Oh, there's many different lists, and they all have different costs depending on like who or how many funders are in the list. We're giving a lot of them are discounted, or we're giving away for free right now. So if you are interested in finding out more about how the database could be helpful for you, yeah, I encourage you to check that out. Check out the website. I think. And then the other part of the question was, what are some of the other things that Access Philanthropy does?
Yeah, if there's anything else that might be applicable to the folks in this room that you haven't already stated.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Access Philanthropy does a lot of different things. So yeah, like I said, we take on clients to help them access funders or foundations. We also take on foundations or funders as clients to help them access and find different nonprofits. We do like marketing consulting, capital campaign consulting, and and another thing that we do is at various times, me or somebody else will write like an in-depth report on a particular subject. So I think for the past couple of years, this just didn't happen this year, but for the past couple of years, I've written a report on how philanthropy, like what funding looks like in the LGBTQ, for LGBTQ organizations. So that was like looking at like who is giving money to LGBTQ issues and for what. And that was really, yeah, that's really interesting. And I believe we still have copies of those somewhere on our website if you wanted to look at that. And then I also did another report, this was like 5 or 6 years ago, on who are the largest corporations that are giving to environmental organizations, and what are they giving for, and what are those agreements look like, and what are those like, yeah, what is that grantor grantee relationship. So we do like very like nuts and bolts kinds of things, and we're like a very small organization. It's just like a handful of us that work there, but it's but yeah, we also do some like in-depth things. I mean, we try to really keep an eye on like what is happening to philanthropy as a whole, and really try to respond to the needs that are happening. We have a list right when in mid-March, we made a separate list of giving programs and grants that were available for people that had come about because of COVID and coronavirus. And so we do like immediate sort of responsive things like that, really trying to just like get information about funders out there to as many people as possible.
Thanks. All right, another question. What if grantees all started writing reparations into our grant proposals as a line item in the meantime while we dismantle the system?
Wow, that's great. I think that's a phenomenal idea. I think that's a phenomenal idea, and I think it like really gets at the heart of it. And yeah, I love that idea. I don't know what else to say. That's great.
I think it also brings up how can we be understanding the full cost of our work in a lot of different ways, because one of the
Totally.
Characteristics of white supremacy culture is asking for too little money to do too much work. So what is it that you actually need in order to care for your community and to do your programs and to do that work? And part of that might be reparations, and part of it might be how do you creatively say that to give back to the community, kind of in the way you were talking about with nonprofits as buffers, I think is an interesting solution.
Totally. I think it's also like there's a mental shift about like, you know, this like why is this like it's the myth of capitalism that furthers this idea that all of this money belongs to those few individuals in the first place. And so like this person who spoke up in the Open Society Institute board meeting, you know, I think like reminding ourselves, reminding each other, and reminding these institutions like where this money came from in the first place is like is an important part of like changing this culture, you know, is like it's instead of feeling like, oh, they're like, we're, you know, like, thank you for this like generous, like, you know, like this like generous gift of like what was yours, you know, is like to really shift our thinking and be like, no, like this is about the collective, and this is about collective struggle, and like I think like that's one of the values that's going to need to change if we're going to be able to like undermine this plutocratic system that we're all in right now.
Great. We only have one more question here, but if there are any others that folks want to chime in, we've got about 7 minutes left on our time, if anyone would like to. And I'm going to read this question, but it's pretty specific and it's based in New York, so maybe we can boil it down a little bit, but that's okay for what we need today. So they've said, we founded a theater for gender-based justice in our inner New York enclave. How do we circumvent and confront the neoliberal media endowment that cherry picks, markets, and reinforces how the conversations around racial and gender divisions are of representation are amplified within the nonprofit industrial complex, creating a grassroots network that reinforces the needs of the collective actions at the true grassroots while providing support that isn't inaccessible to neurodivergent persons who don't have access to elite credentials. So large question, but I think maybe we can talk about how are we supporting each other to create grassroots movements and get to the work that really needs to be done. And Joaquin, feel free to summarize better than I have, if you would like.
Oh, I'm like almost tempted to ask you to read the question over again. But I think that I understand it. I think that what your summary is a good like distillation, and maybe I just would encourage the person who asked the question if I start answering the question that's not the question that you wanted to
type in the chat.
Yeah, type in the chat.
In 4 minutes, please.
Well, honestly, the first thing that came, I think we could spend a whole nother hour and a half talking about that question. So I just want to say that first. I think so, but from like a gut level, where I first went upon hearing that, like I think that I've been thinking a lot about like about this like pedestal idea and how pedestals work. And I don't just mean like affirm, like I don't mean like I think they work differently than like affirming the people that we love or respect who are like in our community. Like this isn't like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be affirming of each other. I just think that there's like something, I think the way that capitalism puts people on pedestals, like funders, or just rich people in general, or celebrities, or like the way that, like exceptionalism like works in like a racial context, that there's just something about the tendency to put people on pedestals that within the culture of capitalism and within in the overculture, which I think is at its heart insidious and undermines our movements. And I think one of the things that has been so striking to me about the uprising that's been happening here in Minneapolis, and in other places, and I've seen other people comment on this as well, is that like these uprisings like are being described as like these like leaderful movements, but that it's harder to like pick out like, a person or like a couple of people who are like leading it in some way. And okay, this is getting like a little convoluted. 3 minutes now, I see. I just think there's like this like there's this question of like how, like it's almost as like we're taught that if like becoming, the more well known we are, like that's how we can gauge our success, or like, and yeah, this is getting a little all over the place, but I think I'm having like a lot of questions about that, and I'm seeing a lot of hope, and the spaces in which I feel like in my heart and in my gut are like our radical spaces that are not being co-opted, is where there's a lot of leaders in the room. And yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have more of a cogent thought than that, so maybe I'll just leave that there.
That's great, thanks. And with just about 2 minutes left, I think I'm going to close this out actually by just reading the last question, which I don't think we need to answer right now, but I'm thinking it's a question for us all to ponder as we continue going forward. So the question is, for people with money, foundations and charities, the ways to hide money and get a tax benefit, what does another model look like? Direct donations to artists, giving them a living wage, health insurance and a pension for the same tax benefit. The model needs to be reworked. So just offering the question into the space, what does another model look like? What does the future look like, and how can we reimagine something that we maybe don't even know what it looks like yet? So sorry to that person that we're not answering, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you.
And with that, I'll say thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Walken and C, so much for your work.
Thanks to everyone who's here. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, C. Yeah, and I hope to continue this conversation with anyone who's interested.
Awesome. And with that, we're closing out our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.